Experience the life-changing benefits of automated insulin delivery with the T-Slim X2 insulin pump from Tandem Diabetes Care. Snack while you meal prep, doze off on the couch, wear it fashionably or discreetly. You can do it all with the #1 rated automated insulin delivery system according to a DQ&A patient panel. Get started at tandemdiabetes.com. RX only, indicated for patients with type 1 diabetes 6 years and older. Warning, Control-IQ technology should not be used by people under age 6 or who use less than 10 units of insulin per day or who weigh less than 55 pounds. Safety info available at tandemdiabetes.com/safety-info.
You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Welcome back to the Climate Conversations. I'm Julie Yoo. Today, we embark on a deep dive into the captivating world of coral reefs. These vibrant ecosystems hang in the balance, threatened by human activity and a warming planet. Did you know that without major interventions, most of these precious ecosystems will vanish by 2035? But there's hope on the horizon. Right here in Singapore, an ambitious reef restoration project is underway. Starting in 2024, 100,000 corals will be planted and grown in our waters, an ambitious endeavor that aims to bolster biodiversity and give our reefs a fighting chance. But why should we care about coral reefs? What are the challenges they face and strategies to ensure their survival? Today, we have a true coral conservation champion joining us. Dr. Karenne Tun, a director at the National Parks Board's National Biodiversity Center. Dr. Tun, welcome to the Climate Conversations.
Glad to be here.
So, Doctor, you've been at the forefront of protecting and restoring Singapore's coral reefs for more than a decade now. Tell us what started your love affair with corals.
I would say, my love affair with the marine environment in general started when I was an undergraduate, when I took that diving course. And the first time you go underwater, it's a completely new environment, right? And the only sense you really have is your sense of sight, because whatever you're hearing is just bubbles breathing from a device. It's so foreign to you. Then you're panicking, you're wondering, am I going down too fast? What's going to happen? Then you see the reef.
Yeah.
Beautiful corals in front of you with the fish, and then you forget about the completely foreign environment. And I think that was that enlightenment for me. I said, I love this environment, it's so beautiful. Then, of course, as the years go by, you hear about how the coral reefs are being impacted, how sensitive they are.
Yeah.
At that time, I was also doing a bit of work in the reef ecology lab, and I decided this is what I want to do. I want to work with the people who are trying to find solutions to ensure that this beautiful environment can be there for generations to come. So that kind of started my whole journey.
You must spend a lot of time in the water.
I used to. Unfortunately, now I don't get as much chance, but I do a lot of other interesting things now. But back in the day, I was diving maybe 100 to 150 days a year.
Oh, wow.
So 2-3 times a week, during the peak periods. And I think I've clocked over 5,000 hours. I stopped counting, so I spent a lot of time underwater. I got to work regionally with different groups of people who are studying and monitoring coral reefs. I got to dive in some of the most amazing places. I think the most unique places I've dived in would be Micronesia. Most people have even heard of this place.
Can you tell me more about it?
So Micronesia is a small group of islands right in the middle of the Pacific Oceans. Tiny islands, population 20,000, 30,000. So really remote areas when you can see both the beauty of the environment, but also the way people depend on it and how it can be impacted. So it really opened my eyes to how easy it is for such ecosystems to be destroyed, either by human action or climate change now that is really devastating many parts of the reef.
Over the years of diving to see corals, what struck you about their condition? Because you talked about the destruction. Is it palpable, the decline of the coral reefs?
That's a very interesting question, because when you talk about destruction, you need to also look at it from a historical perspective, right? Coral reef science is relatively new compared to other disciplines, maybe around 40 years, 50 years, when scuba diving became accessible to the general public, to scientists. So that's about maybe 50, 60 years only when people started collecting data. So we have that historical baseline that we can compare with. And in Singapore, the first data started coming in around the late 1980s. So back then, of course, there was not as much knowledge, awareness of the marine environment and the kind of impacts. So we could see from the 80s to maybe the 1990s, there were decline both in where they are found in the reef, in the depth of the reef, as well as their condition. But then when awareness came in, then people started saying, look, we need to do something about it. And action started being taken both at the academic level, but also at the regulatory, at the government level. And then you could see the conditions start to improve around the 2000s. And by 2000 and mid-2000, around the time when there's a lot more regulation of administrative processes in place, you could see that coral reefs have kind of improved back to the state when they were in like 1980s, and they're kind of stabilized. So I think what strikes me is this environment is sensitive, but it's also resilient. So it's kind of like one of those conundrums, right? It's sensitive, it can easily be destroyed, but if you give it time, a bit of love, it can actually recover.
What's interesting is I've heard that they're among the longest lived animals on the planet. Maybe that resilience explains that.
Possibly. I mean, corals are simple. And that's another interesting thing, right? They're one of the simplest animals.
And they're animals,
And they're
right?
animals, yes. And they are animals.
And because by just looking at them, they're so vibrant and diverse in colors, many often think they're flowers.
So that's another interesting thing about them. They are animals, and as animals, they can feed. But they also have this very interesting symbiotic relationship with an algae that lives in them that gives them color. So a coral without an algae is translucent.
I see.
So a coral with algae gives it a different colors. In our waters, because of the light environment, they're usually brown. In clearer waters where UV can penetrate the water depth, they can have the hues of pinks and blue and green. So they can be quite colorful, especially when there's sufficient UV light that gets to them.
And they do more than just providing underwater beauty. Why should we care about them?
I think humans need to realize that our existence depends so much on the environment at every level, whether it's a coral reef or a rainforest or mangrove forest. And for coral reefs, a lot of people don't realize that they occupy a very small percentage of the ocean. Less than 1% of the ocean are coral reefs. But because they're so diverse, a lot of the diversity in the world depend either directly or indirectly on coral reefs. So up to 25% of the animals that you find in the marine environment have some dependence on the reef. And that's important to us because we eat fish, right? And marine fish is really one of the major protein sources for coastal communities, especially in the region. So without coral reefs, protein sources go down. You basically lose that ability to fish to get that protein source, and that becomes an existential threat to humanity.
You've traveled around the world. Can you just provide some examples where coral reef destruction is most severe?
It depends on the context and where you are and who's depending on the reef. One of the things that really opened my eyes was when I was working at the World Fish Center. I think it was 2002 to 2004. I was the regional coordinator for the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Networks. I got to travel around. Then I realized people's dependence on the reef differ from region to region. In countries where they have to feed their family, and the only way to feed their family is to go and take whatever that you have on the reef, because the big fish, the high value fish, are always exported to countries that can pay for it. So although we like to call for global action to try to save the reefs, I think we cannot forget the man on the ground, the people who depend on them on a daily basis. They are the ones who are going to suffer the consequence of reef loss more than we would. So I think that needs to be brought into the conversation globally, that the communities that depend on them directly, we need to find solutions for them as well, because they will be the one who will suffer first before we see the consequence of it.
Hello, my name is Steve Lai,
And I'm Teresa Tang, and we are the hosts of CNA Correspondent.
a podcast that takes you to the heart of the work our correspondents do across the globe.
From China's COVID response to the childcare center massacre in Thailand.
And from the fall of Najib Razak to the rise of Anwar Ibrahim as Malaysia's Prime Minister.
We speak to the people at the reporting front lines.
So if you want to know how the biggest global stories unfold, make sure you follow or subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.
If we were to just zoom in Singapore, what are some of the biggest factors threatening our coral reef survival?
The data that we have over the last 3 decades show that our coral reefs are stabilizing in terms of their coral cover. The thing that might be changing is the community composition. So say I have a 50% coral cover on this 100 square meters of reef. What does that mean now compared to 20 years ago? So what we're finding is, although reef cover might be maintained, the reef composition is changing. So previously we might have had more branching corals. Branching corals would attract different kinds of biodiversity. Now you're having more plate, like corals are flat. You lose a 3-dimensional diversity. That could have other functional impacts we don't know yet. So there are changes that are occurring. I think the scientific community is trying to understand some of these changes and assess what is the consequence so that we can intervene. In Singapore, coral reefs are impacted by activities. Activities could be anything that introduces things that reefs are sensitive to. So sediments is one of it.
Oh.
So there are a lot of measures in place in Singapore now to ensure that whatever activity that goes on in our waters, we don't introduce that sediments. And coral reefs, they're sensitive to sea surface temperatures. And I think scientists believe that at least locally, that was probably the major issue we'll need to deal with in the immediate and the near-term future. How are our corals going to deal with increasing sea surface temperatures?
Okay, let's talk more about that. I mean, Singapore has taken massive steps forward in coral conservation. Tell us about some of the efforts that you were involved in.
Recently, a minister, he announced the 100,000 Coral Initiative.
Yes.
So that's a big thing. That's our new big project that's coming up. It's exciting. When we announced it, we said we'll be doing this in the next 10 years and beyond because it is an ambitious project. And our land equivalent, the 1 million tree initiative, is slightly different context. When it comes to the marine environment, everything is challenging. It is 10 times more challenging because you're working in an environment that's foreign. To go underwater, you need to basically don gear and breathe air from a compressed unit that's not natural to us. So it's limited who can do this kind of work.
Right.
When you're underwater, you got a limited amount of time you have. So number one, your tank only allows you an hour, 1.5 hours. And the deeper you go, the shorter the time you have underwater. There's so many limitations when you work in the marine environment. So we need to incorporate these limitations as we plan forward. The other limitation is, of course, we can't just get corals anywhere. Trees, you can buy trees from nurseries. I can get 10 nurseries to grow a certain number of trees. But for the corals, we have to grow it in specialized facilities. So we work with the St. John's Island National Marine Lab. They have good facilities. They come up with good systems to grow many corals in a single tank. So we're going to use the knowledge they gain from their research to start growing corals in tanks in larger numbers and then outplant it. So I think the last 10 years gave us a lot of knowledge on how to do this well, but we need time to do it properly. And of course, there are many positives out of this. Number one is just the outreach and education. This is a fantastic opportunity to get people to understand that there's a reason why we're doing this. And one of it is to ensure that our corals remain in our waters through different ways of enhancing the environment. But just from a habitat perspective, we're trying to see how we could employ strategies that's been learned, especially the last decade or so when there's so much knowledge gained on restoration techniques, and we're trying to apply that to hopefully maximize the chances of the corals to survive, outplant them.
So tell us about those techniques.
So some of the work that's being done at the universities now, really exciting work. And this is also related to the impacts, right? You talk about sea surface temperatures and how do corals adapt to it. So scientists are now looking at different ways to help corals survive this. So one of it is you build resilience by putting them under a bit of stress. We do that to ourselves. Right? Sometimes if you train a bit harder, you put yourself under a lot of stress, you gain more muscles. Kids who are exposed to eating out get a bit more resilience in their ability to eat all kinds of food. Similarly, if you expose them to a bit of stress, they do survive better. So that's one of the things they're studying. The other thing that scientists are studying is looking at what you call the microbial community. Just like we have our gut bacteria, we always say take your probiotics, right? Because your probiotics will help you to manage your bacterial fauna, manage your digestion. Similarly, corals have their own microbial community living on the outside. So scientists are trying to see, do these community impart some resilience to them in the face of either temperature or other kinds of impact that allow them to survive better? So if we know which strains of bacteria can do that, then we can then start growing corals in these environments where they can take on this bacteria. And then when we move them out, maybe they get a bit more resilient. So we're learning from what we do to ourselves and trying to impart that kind of knowledge to the work that we're doing in restoration. Quite exciting work.
What other measures have proved effective so far in coral conservation?
We just embarked on a recent project and it's still very new, so we're still figuring out how it works. And that's called a mineral accretion on structure. So besides growing corals on, say, a reef that is degraded, we plant it on that. You can also create what we call reef enhancement units and you can grow corals on these. And one of the techniques we're using now is like metal structures, but then you electrify the metal structures. And if you do that in the water, what happens is it will attract calcium ions from the water and create a calcium carbonate coating. there's some anecdotal work that's being done in Thailand and other parts that show that corals that are grown on these structures were able to withstand bleaching in, I think, 2017. So there's that possibility that a little stress, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So we are hoping that techniques like this, where you're able to create environments that can allow corals to survive in a more challenged environment, but if you build that resilience to it, maybe they'll survive better. So we are looking at all these different strategies. We are looking at sonar technology as one of the ways to monitor the environment. And it's not new technology, of course, but it's how it is applied. But if you use it for biodiversity, you can detect, say, vocalizing marine mammals like dolphins. We actually have studied, do dolphins occur in our waters? Although you may not see them because the waters are not so clear, but we hear them underwater. So that's a good sign. The other work the university has done recently is trying to correlate the sound on a reef to the health of the reef. So, of course, you need to filter out all the other sounds like ships moving by and human activities. You take away all the sounds. A noisy reef is a healthy reef. So they're trying to correlate that. If you have a silent reef, it basically means there's nothing going on in there, and there's nothing going on in there. It is not as healthy. So a noisy reef is actually a healthy reef minus the human noise. So these are some of the things that are done. It's not entirely necessary to save the reef, but it gives us a different way to monitor the environment. And Singapore is lucky we can do that.
Absolutely. And coral reefs are among the most sought after destinations for divers. What are some of the practices that divers, dive operators, or tourists should keep in mind?
That's a really good point. I mean, sometimes you can love something to death, right? And we don't want to do that. And I think people are recognizing that. There's this initiative that was started by the United Nations Environment Program. It's called the Green Fins Program. It started more than, I think, close to 15, 20 years ago. So they started this program in Thailand, and now it's an NGO on its own. And the Green Fins Program encourages the diving community, both as an individual, but also as dive operators, to implement responsible diving practice. So basically, gain competency. Don't go down diving in a pristine area if you don't have the skills to manage yourself underwater, because if you don't know how to fin properly, your fins are all over the place. That can break a lot of corals at one time. So it's talking about personal skill development, but also when you're underwater, don't touch things that you don't know. So just avoid as much as you can. Take photographs. If you don't go and poke an animal. So by doing all of that collectively, you reduce impact on the environment. And as dive operators, although everyone is chasing the dive dollar, right? So sometimes they do compromise because people want to see something. And if you're willing to show it to them or to manipulate the environment for them, they give you more. So sometimes that happens. So it's about educating the dive industry and the divers themselves at the same time to make sure that they understand that all these can harm the environment.
Wow, those are some great tips. Dr. Tun, thank you very much for your time. It's been so insightful.
Thank you.
Well, thanks to my guest, Dr. Karenne Tun, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoy this episode. And do remember to subscribe and like this podcast so you know when a new episode drops. You can find CNA's climate and sustainability coverage online at cna.asia. The team behind this podcast is Joanne Chan, Cyan Nguyen, Jacqueline Chan, Crispina Robert, and I'm Julie Yoo, signing off.